Our complete library of episodes is available for free at spotlightonpodcast.com/episodes. There you'll find all of our conversations stretching back to our launch in February of 2020. Check it out. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purria. Today the spotlight shines on Paul Stache, co-owner with his wife and partner Molly Sparrow Johnson of Smoke Jazz Club, one of New York City's premier live music venues. Smoke is celebrating its 25th anniversary throughout 2024, and Paul joined us to talk about the storied venue's past, present, and future. In addition to the club's 25th anniversary celebration plans, we hit on topics like how their business has navigated the transition to a digital world, insight into managing an independent venue, and many of the amazing artists who have graced their stage over the years. Paul, Molly, and the team have built an enduring institution, and I hope you enjoy our talk. If I understand correctly, you're about, a month and a half or so into sort of what you were calling the 25th anniversary festivities. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so what do those festivities look like? What are you doing differently or how are you dressing up what you do in the context of a celebration?
My goal was to bring as many artists through the club who were involved in the early years when we first opened. And at the same time, my other priority was to have as many Smoke premieres this year as possible.
Yeah.
It's always great to bring new people in. And at the same time, we felt it was important to celebrate some of the legacy artists who have been playing at Smoke for almost 25 years and to bring those back in as well.
How big is the tent for you? Do you have a definition or a working definition of jazz or what works for Smoke?
I try really hard not to. My priority is to present great music. We always talk about making the tent bigger. So it's funny that you use that terminology. That's exactly what we're trying to do. I think for us, some of the really exciting things are when you bring them together onto one stage. Those moments are really exciting. And those are special when you're grouping some of those legacy artists with young rising stars and you have sort of intergenerational bands. That I think is very exciting. When you have a 22-year-old musician just coming out of Juilliard with all the chops in the world together with an octogenarian, and you have a group of different generations, that audience respond really well to that. And it's exciting for everyone, I think.
Do you get the opportunity or do you create the opportunity to develop those pairings? Like, do you go to the artist and say, hey, I have a vision and I think you all should share the bandstand together? Or are those walking in the door coming to you saying, we want to do this thing and we'd like a place to present it? Like, could you pull back the curtain a little bit about how something goes from the concept to the stage?
I think both. I think both of those scenarios happen, but I have close relationships with many of the artists who come through the club. We also have a record label and have artists record for our label. And so it has to make sense musically. And it's something that I really enjoy doing. And, I do that for the live shows that I produce at the club. And I do that for some of the record dates that I produce for the label. And that's the fun part. I'm proud to put a group together. And
yeah.
Ultimately, it's a decision of the artist who they want to play with. I might have an idea and they said, yeah, I like that idea, but let's come up with something that might work. That part's exciting.
What are the hats that are in common between running a record label and booking a venue?
The club came first. The record label is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. So the club started quite a bit earlier, but the record label grew organically out of the club. Initially, before the pandemic, we had music 7 nights a week.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have that much music coming through the club all the time, you can experience live music and see it road tested and see how the audience responds, right? And so you have great groups coming through and I can say, hey, this is a special one, I think. How do we feel about recording that?
Yeah.
And sometimes we do it the other way around. Sometimes we say, let's put a group together with the idea in mind that perhaps a recording can grow out of this. Give some thought to who the players would be to best play that music. And we usually bring the band into the club for a 4 or 5 night engagement. Sometimes we record them live, but more often we play the music for 5 nights. And on Tuesday, we go into the studio and record a session. And you have a situation where the band was really able to play that music set after set and try things out. And That's a unique opportunity and in a unique situation. You have the ability to take some of that energy that you have on the bandstand into the studio with you because you just played that music.
Yeah. What do you think about the role and the viability and what it means to be a record label in 2024 and how, if at all, you've seen that opportunity change over the 10 years you've been doing it?
Oh, it changes all the time. No question. It's a labor of love, no doubt about it. What's the saying? How do you make $1 million in the jazz record business? You start with 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where you got to be really careful and watch your budgets and your expenses because it's very easy to spend more money than you can ever recover.
Yeah.
But it changes all the time. And it's funny, when we started 10 years ago, we almost launched with a format that I don't think the world was quite ready for it at that time. And we probably would have failed if it wasn't for a very smart radio producer at NPR station WBGO in New York.
Yeah.
Who talked me out of this from a radio standpoint of view. But the vision back then was just digital downloads and vinyl LPs. That was our concept. And that's almost how we launched. And we ended up not doing that. We ended up doing CDs. And for the first 5 years of our business, that was our primary market.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little unique to jazz and classical music just because of the demographics. I think that there is to some degree and certainly was still a larger CD buying market than there is in other genres. 5 years in, the digital downloads was something that we weren't sure it would survive. We were skeptical of the streaming world. Not because of the concept, but because of the royalty rates.
Yeah.
We weren't quite sure if that would ever add up. I remember buying a new iMac and it didn't come with a disc drive. And I knew we were in trouble.
Yeah.
And so, I looked at some of the younger artists on our roster and I thought if they want to reach audiences under the age of 45, they have to be on Spotify and Apple Music to make new fans and have new audiences find them. And so there was a lot of criticism when we fully embraced the streaming world because there was a lot of concerns about how small jazz record labels will survive with those royalty rates. But we felt that train is going to leave the station with or without us. And none of the DSPs will care if we put our records up there or not, but the artists will care. And I think we got to put the music out there. And that was a decision.
Yeah.
That was halfway through the tenure of the label. And now we're looking at it again. And it's a whole other question mark now. There's a lot of AI music. It's a whole nother thing. And so we're constantly reevaluating where we have now re-embraced the vinyl market. We're putting all our records out on vinyl now.
Yeah.
It's constantly changing. We constantly have to reevaluate.
It's really interesting though. I don't know if I necessarily agree with the analogy I'm about to use, but I think it strikes me as something that you must be forced to contemplate sometimes, which is the streaming services. They live in this weird netherworld between being a format as well as a media.
Yep.
So it's like they kind of are like radio, but they're also kind of like a CD. If you choose to view them like radio, which is sort of how you were initially describing how you made peace with it, it's a great marketing vehicle. And if some pennies trickle in, wonderful. But if it's actually replacing your format, then it's much more problematic.
Yep.
How important is the audiophile world to you? Like, do you participate in the high-end streaming services?
Yes, we do. So one of the priorities that I had early on was when we moved to studio recordings. My vision and my desire was to record high resolution in an analog studio and try to get that audiophile crowd pressed 180 gram vinyl and HD masters. And so that is, I think, an important market for jazz, certainly.
Do you have at this point much of a direct-to-consumer retail business? It strikes me as the live streaming business being a way to really be making now ongoing direct relationships with customers beyond just maybe some regulars that come in or a bit of a tourist crowd, but like having something where people now at home can transact with you and interact with the venue. Do you foresee that as like now you have a channel directly to sort of people's wallets and an ability to have ongoing relationships with them?
We sell our CDs and vinyl LPs direct to consumer. People can do that. And I think there's been a movement in that direction. I think Bandcamp sort of made that possible over there with their platform. And there's a lot of people who know our Bandcamp shop and buy every product on there and sometimes multiple copies. And people like that. And people realize that it's going directly to the small business. You take Amazon out of the equation. And I think people take pride in buying directly to support small business.
Yeah.
Yeah, the live streaming certainly is a way for us to connect people directly to the club. And that for us, it's something that came out of the pandemic shutdown. And we were desperately trying to figure out a way to put music out there. We managed to produce a handful of records during complicated record sessions before there were tests readily available. Everybody was masked and it was a strange time, but we did those. But the live music that came out of the club during that time, the live streams, I think was an important experience for us, for the musicians and for the listeners. We sort of developed a small but very loyal regular crowd who tuned in every Friday and Saturday. We used YouTube as a platform at the time, so there was an opportunity for the listeners to chat with one another. And people would sit there and said, I'm sitting here with a martini, or I'm sitting here with a cup of coffee and a cognac. And it was a way for people to connect with one another when we all couldn't get together and be in the same room and listen to music.
Yeah.
It was a strange time, but it was an emotional time, and it was an important way to bring music to people, I think. But there is still a small group of really loyal fans, loyal jazz fans and fans of the club and supporters of the club. They all reached out to us before the reopening, pleading with us to please keep the live streams going. So we are still doing that. And it is, I wouldn't call it a business model. So I'm not sure it's connecting to people's wallets. It's more to connect to people in general, via the music.
Without divulging any sort of financial numbers or viewership numbers that you're not comfortable divulging, how did you get it to the point where you could sustain it? Like, did you basically build enough of an infrastructure that it's low cost or minimally incremental cost, so it's not killing you to do it if only a handful of people show up? Or if you don't sell enough tickets in advance, do you just like not flick the switch? How is it viable, I guess is what I'm asking.
It's not automated. This was one of the things that I felt strongly about. It's got to look good and it's got to sound good. We did invest quite a bit of money in the initial setup to be able to stream in HD and have 6 camera angles and moving cameras and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I wish I could base it on advanced ticket sales. Many of those sales are last minute. And the way for me to justify it financially is we have a record label as well. And we do quite a few live dates at the club still. And having good video of the artist is really crucial. So if I put that record out, I want to have video to coincide with it. Even if I end up not making a record date, that artist might come into the club again 6 or 12 months later. And now I have a high quality video of the performance to promote that next performance. It's a promotional tool. It promotes the venue. It promotes the artist. And if it doesn't make a profit or doesn't always pay for itself every night, it's a marketing tool.
Yeah. I think about that similarly with what I do here with the podcast. We just recently crossed our 200th episode. And although there's not really a business model around having the catalog,
Yep.
When I reflect on it, I think it's never a bad thing to have this catalog of conversations and audio and video. And so even if going into it, you don't necessarily know what the opportunities are going to be, I can't imagine it's a bad thing having such great material, such great artists captured. And maybe in some cases, the opportunities will present themselves. Like you said, at the very least, it's promotional material.
Yeah.
It seems like if you can do it, why not do it?
That's right. I think that's, in a way too, it's a perk for the artist, an additional perk. As a small venue, we have to make our offers to our artists as attractive as we possibly can. We can't compete with seats that have 200 or 300 capacity. And so having, a good piano, for instance, is one of the ways to do that. Having a good sound system, having the artist feel comfortable up there with a good microphone collection and a good sound system and a good sound engineer. Those are things that artists will appreciate. Having the live stream footage afterwards is also an additional perk that the artists have who perform there. They get that footage afterwards. They can use that footage for promotional use to promote their upcoming gigs, and they can chop it up into little clips. And so I think it's a marketing tool, not just for us, but for the artists themselves as well. And I think it's an important piece.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. If you enjoyed this episode of Spotlight On, please share us with a friend and leave a review or star rating on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks. And now, back to Spotlight On. It's interesting you mentioned the capacity, because that's something that's always sort of blown my mind about your venue, your growth up until sort of recent renovation. But even then, it's not like you've built this gargantuan venue. Like, you've increased capacity, obviously, but not at the expense of intimacy.
Yeah.
It's just really fascinating to me how you've made it work.
Yeah, it's a challenge all the time. It's no question about it. There are advantages to this and there are challenges to this, right? It's the problem with a small room is that it's hard to make up for the quieter nights midweek with a really busy Saturday night, because your Saturday night might sell out, but you can't put that many more people in to really make up for a slower midweek night. And so it's a challenge all the time. Speaking of capacity, one of the things that nudged us to do this renovation was we were sitting there and a friend of ours came in who was an architect, and I said, "Hey, can you help us figure out these social distancing regulations and figure out in a creative way how many people you think we could fit in here?" And so we went in there, and when you have a room, you've been in there for a long time, yeah, that's the bar on the left-hand side, but you never really figure out what percentage of the room the bar actually takes up. So now you measure and you have your back bar and your bartender aisle and your bar counter and your bar stools, and you realize all of a sudden, whoa, wait a minute, the bar area is more than a third of the club and we can't use it. And then we continued measuring and we realized, okay, so the maximum capacity will be 12. As someone who has tried to figure out to make a small venue work over the years, even I realized that there was no ever going to be a viable business with 12 seats. And so we're like, well, I guess we're going to have to wait this out. What do we do during that time? Let's find a way to get a little bit bigger. People probably going to appreciate a little extra elbow room when we reopen. And so, yeah, it's a challenge. And what's a real challenge here right now for me and for our team is trying to figure out how to keep it affordable for people.
Yeah.
Because everything is expensive. New York has gotten ridiculously expensive. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we can pay our artists a decent wage, and finding that balance between a ticket price that gets it done to pay the band and a ticket price that all age groups and all people can still enjoy live music. That's a balancing act that we're constantly having to deal with and we're constantly tinkering with. When we reopened, one of the things that we implemented, which we didn't have before, because we always felt it was silly to do in such a small room, but it became necessary, was to have different sections in the club where the music charge varies from a top tier ticket to a ticket that's at times 75% less than the top ticket. We have premium seating right up front. We have seating with maybe a side view of the stage that's 30% less than the top tier ticket. Then we have standard seating. Yeah. And then we have this little section, which is a quirky little standing room that the fire department of New York approved us to have. The standing room is very regulated in New York. So it's not the most ideal setup for standing room, but it's got great sight lines of the stage. And when a ticket at night costs $55 in the premium seating, you can get that ticket for $20. It allows sometimes students or young musicians or people have all kinds of reasons why they can't pay $55 for the ticket. So if we want people to experience live music, we think it's really important.
It sounds like there's a real sensitivity to balancing all the stakeholders there, whether it's, your responsibility as a business owner, your commitment to the artist, your commitment to developing audience, providing a good audience experience. I would imagine that level of consideration is what contributes to us having a conversation that marks the 25th anniversary of the venue. You don't stay in business like that for 25 years by not thinking about the needs of all the constituents.
Yeah, standing still, and it's not really an option. That's right. I mean, it's not a static concept, but you have to look at it and reevaluate it and change things over time. And what may work in one decade may not work in the next. Right now, I think we're all dealing with the fact that everybody feels life has gotten too expensive, and I don't blame them, but it's tricky at times, and wholesale costs are crazy, and you have to reevaluate things all the time.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you were doing 7 nights a week and now you're down to 5. Is that a lifestyle choice, or do you aspire to get back to 7?
And that's an interesting question. A little bit of both. When we first reopened, we were a very small team. Many of the people who had been with us for a long time either left the industry or left New York City. A lot of people reevaluated what they were doing during the pandemic. And I think there were maybe 2 or 3 people that returned after reopening. And we basically had to build a new team from scratch. We had a hard time finding a team quickly enough to be able to do 7 nights a week. The other part of this is minimum wage increases in New York, as difficult as they are for a small business, are necessary. But the result of that also is that labor cost is much higher. I used to be able to open on a Monday or Tuesday night and deal with the economics of maybe having the room only half full. When I'm looking at what that costs now, the operating costs, given the labor costs that we're dealing with now, that's not really affordable. I have to be able to focus on the peak nights where I at least have a chance of getting a full show. And that's not always possible on a Monday or Tuesday. But the third point, and that's an important one, I own and operate the place with my business partner, who is also my wife. We're a family operation. We have 2 kids, and needing a little time off and having the venue closed is important for us. And we just need the time off. We need to recharge the batteries, and we need to have a little time away from it. And so that's another consideration of this.
Do the kids have any interest in either the music or the business?
That's interesting. They're 10 and 14. And so it's probably a little early to figure that part out. I'm not someone who would ever have those kind of expectations of my kids to tell them that they have to take over the family business.
Yeah.
Who knows? They might look at us and say, you guys are crazy. You work too much and I don't want anything to do with it. And I would laugh and say, yes, you're probably right.
Yeah.
They do love music. My 10-year-old plays drums. My 14-year-old plays, or perhaps I should say played piano. It's unfortunately something that fell a little bit behind during the pandemic. Music lessons over Zoom was not nearly as exciting to him as ensemble classes in person. And so he's trying to get back to it. I don't know, but yeah, I'm not sure if they would be interested in taking the family business over there. They're more than welcome to, but no pressure from us.
You've mentioned piano now a couple of times. You mentioned the importance of the investment you made in the piano. Piano really seems to be having a moment. I get a lot of interesting pianists here in these conversations. And I wonder, do you see that when you look back over 25 years? Like, do certain instruments have their moments and then recede? Or how do you see those musical moments come and go, or musical trends?
That's interesting. I've not noticed that. I wouldn't have noticed a trend by instrument. What I can tell you is that we've had some incredible pianists come through the club. The one that will first come to mind, of course, is the late, great Harold Mayburn, who was really, really important to the club, who performed on opening night in 1999, and who was one of our biggest supporters and an incredible musician and an even greater human being, and somebody who recorded for us. He was the first record we ever released, was a Harold Mayburn album. We were really lucky to have Larry Willis, Ronnie Matthews. I mean, there's a lot of giants of this music that came through the club who were pianists and still are. I mean, we have an incredible lineup of pianists coming through the club this summer, from Cyrus Chestnut to Eric Reed to Vijay Iyer, Kevin Hayes, a lot of great pianists coming through. One of my favorite formats at the club, purely in a musical sense, because it is not always the most popular format in terms of ticket sales. But my personal favorite format is the piano trio. When we opened 25 years ago, one of my first ideas was to have a piano trio night, and it was Thursday night at the time. And I really wanted that to work. And we had some incredible shows, and we had some successful ones. But it's not always the most popular format. I think that in a jazz club, people appreciate a solo as a horn player with a band. And that's great. Many great horn players coming through, of course. And we're very lucky to have this weekend, for instance, the great Nicholas Payton is coming through, trumpeter and pianist, actually multi-instrumentalist. But I love the piano trio. Cedar Walton trio used to come through. It was just magic.
I've been involved with a lot of independent venues in my professional life outside of this. Do you have relationships with other venue owners and operators, or are you an island of one? Like, how is that as a professional community for you?
Now, more so than before the pandemic. It's a small community of people that come and love this music, and then it's a very loyal group, but it's a small group. But I always felt that we should be probably closer to one another as club owners than we are. And in many cases, people see it as competitive sport a little bit, and they feel that vying for the same audiences, which is, I don't think is quite true. I think that Smoke in particular has a very specific local crowd.
Yeah.
We're not downtown. There's no huge tourist foot traffic naturally on 106th and Broadway. So I made more calls to other club owners during the pandemic for sure than ever before. And we were all just trying to figure out what we're going to do. We were comparing notes. Did you get this grant application in? Did you get this loan application in? How are you dealing with this? What are you doing with live stream? What are you doing with masking? All that stuff. One of the reasons we're still around is we actually were one of the few venues who had a landlord who was supportive. And we said, you've been here this long. Let's talk about it on the other end of the pandemic. Don't worry. And that's the way it should be, but that's not the way it usually is. And especially in New York, it can be very tricky. And I know that many other club owners had all kinds of pressure from their landlords to continue to pay rent while they weren't making any money. So we were lucky that way.
Do you aspire to own a building, or is that too big of a bite in New York?
I think it's too big of a bite in New York for what we're doing. I wish I had that opportunity. I I tried 15 years ago to convince the building owner to sell me the commercial space. I'm not even sure. We didn't even get to a price tag. I'm not even sure if I would have been able to figure out the finances of it, but they were not interested in doing that. And after the pandemic, before we started the renovation, we were thinking, well, we could go somewhere else. When you have a loyal neighborhood following and you have a supportive landlord who wants you there, those are all things that you can't take for granted. That's important. And so we made the decision to stay where we are. Yeah, would it be helpful to own the space? Of course it would be, but I'm not sure that jazz club and a jazz record label are able to bring in the kind of revenue that would make that possible. And not in New York City anyway.
I think about the nature of competition with venues, and it can be sort of zero sum, right? Like if there's two rock bands playing at two different clubs, like maybe somebody's at Bowery Ballroom and somebody's, in a room out in Brooklyn, I can probably only go to one of those shows. But I remember so many times in New York, because of the nature of jazz clubs and the multiple sets, catching a show at your place or at Jazz Standard and then hopping in the taxi and going downtown and catching a late set at the Blue Note and just feeling like those were incredible New York nights. So exciting to be zipping around and seeing these world-class musicians. And it's something that's so unique to that music, right? Just the way the formats of the shows have established themselves over the years in these sort of like 60, 70, 80-minute sets, the ability to do an early and a late, the business need to do multiple sets a night. I have this very romantic memory in my mind of those nights.
I was one of those people too. And I think that still happens. And that's, I think in a nutshell too, why maybe a less of a competitive field than some people think it is.
Yeah.
People still go to smoke for the first set and grab dinner and then go see the late set at the Vanguard or Birdland or Smalls. I mean, that happens all the time. And so I think ultimately the jazz audiences are really loyal audiences. They love this music and they will do exactly what you were just talking about.
Thank you so much, Paul Stache and the team at Smoke. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, ongoing postings on our official blog, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.